If at the end of your career, all you can say is, I was a national champion and we won a lot of games, then I would say it wasn't worth the time and energy. But if you can look back and say, I learned a lot about myself, I did things I never thought possible, both physically and psychologically, I made the most important and lasting relationships of my life, I've learned that helping others and seeing them succeed at something is better than having it happen to me, then it is without question worth all that you do. That's a quote from an email Scott Fry, the women's soccer coach at Messiah College, sent to his team in 2010, and it sums up the many measures of success that both the men and women's program have beyond winning national championships. In our third and final episode, going deep inside the Messiah College soccer culture with guests Mike Zigarelli and Dave Brandt, we're going to get some final takeaways from both Coach Brandt as well as Mike Zigarelli on where we can go from here as coaches. Welcome back to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nurbin, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. The podcast is brought to you by TOC Culture Consulting, which provides mentorship and community for coaches who are looking to build better cultures and become better leaders. If you'd like to join our mentorship program as well as community, you can schedule a call with Nate or myself at thriveonchallenge.com, as well as you can get the notes to this episode and every episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast. Now, let's jump into the last part of our conversation with Coach Dave Brandt.
Dave, I want to ask you a couple of questions just based on your own personal experience in coaching here. The first one being, you mentioned now you've gone from Messiah to the Naval Academy to Pittsburgh to Hope. You've made some job changes here over the last 15 to 20 years. And I know a lot of our coaches have encountered opportunities, but don't always know, how do you think through that? There's the one thing of, I want to be challenged at the next level. Could my stuff work? Could my vision work in a different setting, in a larger, bigger level, whatever it might be? But just the thought process, your discernment process, how did you go about thinking about, because I'm sure you had plenty of opportunities before the Naval Academy. How do you think through job opportunities and when to make a move and when to stay?
Yeah, that's so I'm trying to think of how to answer this, because my first response is, you're asking the wrong guy, because I'm not sure if I've thought through that process well. Crazily, I actually did not have opportunities for the Naval Academy. It's the darndest thing. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity at Navy. And, I don't know how to judge these things. And again, that's a terrible answer. I'm just being honest. So people know not to ask me, ask somebody who knows. But I look back, I think the Naval Academy was just an incredible place to be, unbelievable life experience, absolutely awesome, loved it. And, I think then I went into the pro game in Pittsburgh is what happened. And I've just always been fascinated by the pro game. And so that was probably a dumb move to leave the Naval Academy. If I had to do over again, I wouldn't do it, period. And so, that just is what it is. That being said, I had an amazing 2-year experience in the pros. Amazing. The people I got to meet, the stuff I got to do, the players I got to work with. It was awesome. I got to do soccer all the time, right? Because it's the pros. It was just absolutely amazing. So, in that sense, it's okay. And it's not a regret, because I got to do it. And it's experience that now I value still. But how do you work through that stuff? Man, I've got really good friends who've stayed and just great coaches and people I love and respect who've stayed at one place. And I've got others I know who've moved. And, I was at one place for 32 years. I was at Messiah from the time I was 14 till I was 46. And some of what contributed to my leaving was simply that, my wife and I knew the world was bigger than Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Look at JP. He lived in Mechanicsburg. Now he's in Ireland. But, and for someone else, that's fine. And it doesn't matter. For us, we'd just been there long enough and we wanted to experience something else. And so that really has nothing to do with profession. It just has to do with life. So I think there's so many variables there for anybody that I at least probably do a rotten job of answering that. So there you go. But that's an answer nonetheless.
Oh, that's all right. It's your answer. So we'll take it. Here's my other question for you. You mentioned your long stint as an assistant coach before getting the head job at Messiah. And one of the challenges that so many coaches that we work with face is getting alignment with their staff. Whether they have this vision, they have this ideal of how they want to play, how they want to practice, who they want to be. And a lot of our coaches are at the high school level, and they don't always have the ability to just go find another coach that's going to buy into that. What kind of advice would you give to someone who, clings to a vision, um, but maybe struggles to get their staff to align to that, both from your experience as an assistant coach with a vision himself, and then obviously, in your experience as a head coach?
Yeah, I think, this is where business writers would, of course, talk about getting, quote unquote, the right people on the bus, right? And so, but then you have situations like you just mentioned where there really isn't another option. For one reason or another, this is the person or these are the people that have been brought together to work with this. But I think alignment is so important. And people, I think, would maybe answer this different ways. I think alignment is so important that I think that it would be better, more beneficial for a leadership, a head coach, to maybe even compromise in whatever ways, in some ways, on his or her vision or what this looks like or what they want in the name of alignment with the staff. Because one way or another, you have to be aligned. Again, my opinion. Otherwise, it just produces all sorts of issues, problems, fights, or whatever, and every day becomes a battle. And so, that may not be someone else's answer, but I think alignment is that critical. And I think a piece of this is just being honest, transparent, and relational, and at some point being willing to sit down together and talk. Not that everything has to be collaborative and you always need to give in. I don't mean that, because after all, I'm a huge fan of an idealistic vision and going for it and all that. But this is where I say leadership is an art form. And I do think there's times when compromise is critical and essential. And so, I would answer in that category just because I think alignment's so important.
You've mentioned a little bit on the episode today about books. You obviously read quite a bit, and Zigarelli talks about a few impactful books in your life. And I'm just kind of curious, as a guy that's really big on personal growth, and I read a lot myself, how you attack, reading. He mentioned there sometimes you find one book, you might read it 3 or 4 times
Right.
before you move on to the next.
So for whatever reason, I can't remember when it started, maybe 20, 25 years ago. I started sort of religiously taking notes on books. And so it's a laborious process the way I do it. And I would throw in, I've probably now become honest enough to articulate that I'm a fan of doing things the hard way. I think there's a health in that in a lot of ways, but it leads to me using words like laborious. So any book I read that I think is worth its salt, I underline, like with a pen, literally, in a real book, not an online version. I underline what jumps out at me, and then I go back and I literally type out word for word what I underline. And it is laborious. It takes time. And I produce for myself a set of notes that I print off and put in a little folder, one for each book. And I've found that process, as sort of, step by step, mundane as it is, reading, underlying, going back, typing, putting it in notes, and then ability to look at the notes has enabled me to retain more from books, because I'm sure, like a lot of other people, I would get frustrated with myself reading a great book that I think is impactful and I think I could use, and just not recalling as much as I'd like to recall. And so originally it was like 5 or 6 key books. Now it's probably 200 or whatever. And I invested hours and hours and hours in this. But I think it's just been a really good exercise and discipline for me. I mean, it's broadened me. I think it's added just to the depth and substance of who I am as a person. And it's just allowed me to learn from others in a way, maybe in a better way than I might have otherwise if I've just given a quick read.
Yeah, and I just want to share a quick story on that because I think what you're saying is really profound. I'd say in my first 5 to 10 years of coaching, I used to read John Wooden like religiously, and I'd read leadership books, and I would underline. And I thought I was reading with intentionality. But I think
Oh,
the big change for me was when I started doing exactly what you do. I do the same process. I read, I underline, and then, like you said, it's painful at times to go back into it, type it up in the computer, organize it. For me, it's obviously oftentimes writing a blog about some concepts in it and how we might apply it. It's sharing with other coaches, and I'm talking about those concepts. But that change of just even typing it up game changer for me as well, as far as my own growth as a coach and as a leader. So I just want to share that, because what you just shared is absolute gold, because I think we live in an age where there's so many great books, there's so many great podcasts, there's so many great speakers like yourself, and people will listen to you today and they'll go, "Oh, that's great." And they will be inspired, but then they will struggle to apply maybe even one thing that you've shared today. And you've shared a handful of amazing things that could help them as a leader and improve their culture. And that's kind of leads me to my last question for you, which is, you know, if you could give a message to coaches out there, because you're a role model, you're a, you know, I think once you reach a certain level of success as a coach, people really start to model you from the outside, not just your players. And so I always, am curious if you could give a message to any coach out there, thinking of even your kids coach or your grandkids coaches down the line, what would that message be that you really wanted them to hear, to take in, and to maybe apply within their coaching?
It's good. I thought you were about to say once you reach, and then I was going to say, I was going to hear you say a certain age, and I'm like, thanks a lot. So you slipped by that. That's good. I think that's probably the hardest question you guys have asked me. I really do. That that single nugget of wisdom that I'm supposed to have. I mean, not on the basis of you asking me the question, but I think that's hard. I think coaching and leadership is complicated. It's hard. It requires passion and heart, and so I guess I'm inclined to say two things. One, I would beat the idealism drum again, because I think the knock on idealism, i.e., wanting things to be awesome, great, just right, the way they ought to be, the knock is that it's unrealistic. And that, everybody, especially when you're young, you got all this energy, you got this pie in the sky vision, good for you. We all know as we go along, you end up having to compromise, give in, you forget, you lose your energy. And I'm sort of pounding my fist on the table saying, no, 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 it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't. Like idealism, nothing more than a commitment to the way things ought to be, right? Commitment's a big word in any walk of life. But, what are we here for? And so I've got an attitude towards work. I think it's a good thing. I think commitment is a good thing. It's not an easy thing, but it's a good thing. And it's just amazing what that sort of attitude, if you're willing to commit to it, can be. I guess my other thing would be to just be real and to be vulnerable enough to be real. I tell my guys all the time, I'm like, there's no secrets with me. Like my heart is right here. It just is. That's just the way I am. And it's okay. But sometimes when your heart right here on your sleeve, like that's a good thing. But maybe I'm too much sometimes in a moment, or I can make mistakes because I'm just being too passionate. But I'm honest with myself and with my guys about who I am. The other thing I tell them all the time, I'm like, fellas, like I'm not trying to trick you. This is what I want. This is why. And I just think this sort of vulnerability to sort of go both those places and say those things, as simple as they are, is really important. And I think in the end, what you really ought to do is have a podcast and see what my guys actually think of me. Right. I mean, like, but I honestly, I think they would just sort of nod and be like, he's honest with us. He's real. And I know he cares. And so in the end, I just think those two things are really important and can go a long way. Whether they win me or anybody else next year's championship and all that, I don't know, because I don't control winning. I never have and I never will. But I control process and I can take responsibility and I can do my best. And so it's a little bit of a long answer, but my best effort.
Well, Dave, we'll get you out of here on this one, and I'm going to try to ask this delicately now that you put JP on the spot a bit here. But it seems from my vantage point that you might be closer to the end of your career than the beginning of your career. And I'm curious, as you have talked so much about idealism and vision, as well as I do, and I've been doing this for 20 years, your perspective in coaching and in purpose and all of those things continue to evolve with experience and with relationships and the ups and downs of the coaching journey. And I just wonder, as you look over the horizon, however long that is, and I'm not trying to put you out to pasture here, but for somebody that really thinks a lot about what the ideal situation would be, how do you look at kind of the back half of your career and what's left? What's the ideal, for you and your coaching journey with whatever time, number of years that you have left?
Well, I just think, I think for me, it's evolved, it's ebbed and flowed. I've used that term a couple times. I mean, it's been elastic, but a lot of this hasn't changed, and I'm hoping it doesn't. Just who I am, what I'm trying to accomplish, and so of course perspective changes over time, and you gain experience in this sort of thing. But honestly, I've always felt that experience was overrated, and I have experience, so maybe I'm hurting myself there. I don't know, but I just think idealism and vision is so much more important than quote unquote experience, right? I mean, show me a team that was 7-12 that is returning all its starters, and I'm like, you're showing me a team that's going to go 7-12 next year. I don't mean that in the worst way that it could sound, but something's got to give and something's got to change. And in that sense, I think quote unquote experience can be overrated. So I'm reminded of just before we went live. I'm hoping this is okay. JP's in Ireland apparently, and I'm like, oh, I'm a huge U2 fan. So we chatted about that for a second before we started recording. So I remember reading this once. I think this relates to the question. So I read that Bono in his 40s or 50s, right, the lead singer of U2, was reflecting. He had recently gone in. Apparently, there was an artist or photographer or artist exhibition, and there was a room full of Bono paintings or Bono photographs. I think it was photographs. So imagine that. None of us, I don't think, are quite so famous that could ever happen, but it did to Bono. And so he goes into this room full of Bonos. And he said he was just sort of struck, and he's walking around looking at these things with the artist. And he said, I noticed a picture of myself at 21. He's in his 40s now. And he said, the look in the eye was so much clearer. I'm like, wow. I mean, that like, what do you mean? Right. He said, there was an idealism, there was a vision, there was a purpose, there was a take on the worldness, right? There was I can do this. He said that somewhere along the line, I forgot or I replaced with what he called front, right? With a veneer, with image. He said, it's something I thought I had to do. And then a really cool comment, and I don't know, it was in his 40s or 50s when he said this. He said, I think I'm getting back now to a more real and honest place. So I do think it happens with a lot of us that, we start out young and idealistic, and then we're like, well, we have to appear this, we have to do this, we have to shelve that because that's just young and naive, that's dumb, and it doesn't really work that way. And at some point, maybe in our later years, if we're lucky, we get back to that. And hopefully for me, I've sort of stood fast in the gap and sort of never really gotten rid of that, hopefully, look in the eye at 21, right? But he said that naivety, which I see now in my own kids' eyes when they were young, I thought it should be gone. I thought I had to replace it. So I would encourage anybody listening. So much of this for me is about just being honest with yourself, with others, and being real, not trying to be somebody or feeling like you have to be somebody. And so, for me, otherwise, like over time, I've just sort of hoped to keep that idealistic naivete, which I think in the end is a good thing. And I think the world needs more of personally, and leadership needs more of, from slipping away or somebody stealing it.
What will you miss most about coaching?
So again, I know what I'm supposed to say, but I'm going to tell you the truth instead. I don't mean this in a bad way. I feel like I'm supposed to say the kids, the relationships. So look at me sounding terrible. That's second though, I swear. I will miss making things work and forming something and creating something. I love to create something. I love to work with a group and see how close we can get to fulfilling our potential. That's what I'll miss right at whatever point, if and when I'm not coaching. But the relationships is second, I promise.
No, I appreciate you answering that, because I think that's one of the things, coaches go through rocky times or uncertainty in their career, just coming back to that thing of like, well, what if I lost my job? What if I wasn't coaching next season for whatever reason? What would I miss the most? And just encouraging them to make sure that they enjoy that today while they still have it, and that's been an anchor for me. So I just appreciate
sure. If I can add real quick, I've had a super unusual path, right? Division 3 to Division 1 to the pros to Division 3, which is where I am now. And it's not one that I expected, but on the other hand, I get to do what I just articulated to you. I get to do it. And I'm amazed that I get to do it. And it's super cool.
All right, that's it for our interview with Dave Brandt. If you've got questions for him, he'd love to hear from you. His email address is in the details of this episode as well as on the coaching notes. Now, Professor Mike Zigarelli is going to share how to apply Messiah's principles, as well as share what he believes are some of the greatest challenges to building culture.
Mike, I'm interested in this too. It was exciting for me to get you on the podcast here, not just because you wrote the book, but because you're also, well versed in some of the scholarship and our professor of leadership studies at the college. And you and I and JP were talking a little bit before we got on air here about how you kind of see yourself as the bridge of this story. Not necessarily the architect, but one that's translated it into lessons that can be applied in a lot of different ways. When you think about, how you do that and you translate that to business or to ministry or to education, what are some of the big takeaways or lessons that you extrapolate out that you can apply in some other aspects of life as well?
Yeah, and we've heard from people all over the country, all over the world in different contexts, whether it is, a doctor's office, a dentist's office saying we're applying some of these principles, or it's a cross-country team, or I got a letter from some rugby team in England or whatever, right? So obviously the principles transcend. I think one of the most interesting out of context things that happened was when an executive from Chick-fil-A called me back in 2014. He said, a bunch of us have been reading this book and we're wondering if we can come up to Pennsylvania. This is they're down in Atlanta. We come up in Pennsylvania and maybe you can MC a day where we meet with the varsity soccer coaches and just pick their brains a bit about organizational performance and team building and culture building and learn from them. I mean, this is Chick-fil-A, a world-class organization. They wanted to come up to Pennsylvania and they were going to do two things in PA. They were going to go to Gettysburg and learn how the generals won that battle. And they were going to come to Messiah and learn about this D3 soccer program and how it has won all these national championships. And then they're going to take it back and tell all their franchisees, here's another way that you can make your restaurants better. Right. And so they came up and it was fascinating, just the banter back and forth, but they saw something there that would apply to their business. And so, and we took them into the gym, besides just sitting around a table, we took them into the gym and actually had them play soccer. We said, wear your sneakers because Coach Scott Fry, the women's coach, is going to take you through a bunch of drills and how to go from really little things to bigger things to bigger things to being able to put all these complex skills together into a sort of game day performance. And it was comical sometimes, but took them from the little stuff to the big stuff. And what they said was, these execs said was, this is exactly what we do and we need to do more of in training our people, is train them in the little details really deeply, really incessantly, and then add on some other things. And then you put all that stuff together and you get world-class service when somebody comes into the restaurant. So yeah, this applies in a lot of different contexts, even a place like Chick-fil-A that we think is doing everything right. Maybe this is one of the reasons they do everything right, is they're still willing to keep learning.
I love that story about Chick-fil-A because people that have eaten there obviously know it's a great place to eat and we've experienced that culture.
But they
And
never
it just
stop
comes-
learning, right? I mean, that's I'm sorry to
Exactly.
interrupt you, but I think that's the connection. One of the connections to Messiah is, okay, so we're the best this year, right? We won another national title. What more can we learn? How can we get to the next level? I mean, it's not really about that hardware. It is about the relentless pursuit of excellence and even perfection. And so there's always another level to get to once you've won, right? Otherwise, there's going to be inevitable drop off. And number two is going to be hungrier than number one, and competition is going to pass you. So that continuous improvement mindset and the philosophy that we've never arrived, that there's no finish line, that there's always a higher level to get to because the standard is perfection. Whether it's Chick-fil-A or Messiah or Apple or whatever, world-class organizations tend to think that way.
From your perspective as a leadership professor and somebody in the field here, after doing all of this research and telling this story, you mentioned there that there's other colleges that have caught up and there's programs that have obviously improved and, risen alongside Messiah at that Division III level. But what do you think are the biggest obstacles that keep other teams or might keep programs or keep leaders from being able to replicate, some of these 7 principles, like what is, because it's obviously unique, right? Such a unique story. It's not done by everybody. What makes it so challenging to accomplish something like
Mhm.
this in the way that they've done it?
Yeah, and it was that quite unique. It might be in D3 soccer, but this is UConn women's basketball. This is John Wooden at UCLA basketball. This is the All Blacks rugby team in New Zealand. This is Arizona softball. I mean, there are teams out there that have had these dynasties and been able to have these long-term runs. But as far as what are the obstacles, one, I would say it's knowledge, not knowing exactly how to do what I want to do. I might have a vision for it, but as far as implementing that, as far as executing, I'm not really sure. So part of it is lack of knowledge. Part of it is maybe lack of time, or maybe the better way to put it is lack of will. Just given the amount of time it takes to to build and sustain a culture that's going to drive everything else and change the mindset, especially teenagers, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and especially teenage boys who might be much more egocentric than on the girl side. Oh my goodness, how much time does that take? Anybody who's a parent knows how much time it takes to try to shift mindset and to elevate the will in some way. So I think lack of knowledge, maybe lack of time or unwillingness to put in the time are probably the two biggest obstacles. But the coaches are absolutely clear on this. This is a system that could be implemented almost anywhere. It's that transferable.
Curious, you really come across as a guy that's not just a researcher, a professor, a teacher, author, consultant. And I know you mentioned in some of our email correspondence you're actually coaching soccer, I believe yourself. But I'm curious how this book might have affected you personally. Within your own personal growth as a leader in the home and maybe outside of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I remember asking Dave Brandt, give me one secret of success, if you just boil it down to one thing. And he said, without hesitation, without blinking, without looking at notes, he said, organizational culture is everything. Nothing is more important than organizational culture. It's everything, and it's 100% under your control. And again, as somebody who studies this, somebody who's in the field, yeah, I kind of get that, but the depth and the intensity of the comment and sort of the centrality of it to his entire system and his entire philosophy really made me go back and look at, what's the culture of my classroom? What's the culture of this school that I'm leading as a dean? What's the culture of this family that I'm running? And what are the sort of the norms there? And am I being intentional enough at shaping these norms and this mission and this sort of collective goal that we have as husband and wife? What's the culture in my marriage? Any number of leadership contexts, it would apply there. So I think that it's something that I certainly knew, but I'm not sure that I had executed that, implemented that to the extent that I really should have. Because, and leaders drive culture, and culture drives everything else. And so that's probably the fastest and most efficient and way to affect behavior and to ensure that that it's stable long term.
I got 2 more questions for you, Mike, before we get you out of here. One of them is, one of the unique aspects of the culture and the organization at Messiah is that it is a faith-based organization, and that higher purpose certainly comes out in the story of the Messiah soccer program. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of speak to that in the sense of how that helps the coaches and the players to transcend, just winning and losing and chasing championships. Where does that faith component really play into the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, some might be wondering, can I do this in a secular environment? Can I do this if I'm not a person of faith, if I don't share that particular worldview? Is this just sort of this quirky, cultish thing that happens in Grantham, Pennsylvania, or wherever Christians get together? The general principle here is unity of purpose. And John Wooden, again, to go back to him, I mean, it was fitness, fundamentals, and unity were his 3 pillars of success. And we understand what the first two are, obviously, fitness and fundamentals, but we have to be unified in purpose. We have to have the same goal. We have to be moving in the same direction. It has to be about the team rather than the individual. And we have to see it clearly and be going for it with the same level of commitment. In a faith culture, in our Christian environment, it's a little easier to get there because most of the students coming in, the vast majority of students coming in, all share that kind of unity of purpose and that unity of worldview. And so it's easier to rally them around something bigger than themselves because it's already part of who they are. So if we say, you know, we're playing for God in all that we do, or if, as you know, the girls huddle up and before the game, you know, they don't shout team, they don't shout Messiah, they scream to the glory of God. Right. I mean, that unity of purpose is part of who they are. And then it's reinforced throughout the 4 years. It's just easier for a coach to gain that unity when it's already there to begin with. And so I think that's sort of the general principle that's transferable, whether it's faith-based or whether it's focused on something else. It really can't be focused on the individual. It has to be focused on something bigger than the individual. And if you can do that, then, I mean, you know, nothing can stop you when you have that kind of unified mindset.
So a big thank you to Dave Brandt and Mike Zigarelli for taking the time to share with us. If you'd like to get in touch with them, their emails are in the details of this episode. If you enjoyed this series, be sure to share it with other coaches and be sure to check out The Messiah Method by Mike Zigarelli. It's definitely in my top 5 books on culture. Thanks for listening to the Coaching Culture Podcast. If you haven't already, please be sure to leave us a review.